Aestheticism. 37, 90, 156 to 58, 166 to 67, 221 to 22, 261, 301. Aversion. 13, 15 to 18, 25, 42 to 43, 54, 89, 93 to 94, 105, 110 to 112, 121 to 22, 126, 158, 167 to 69, 214, 218 to 19, 281, 304, 332, 341 to 42. Binaries. 21 to 22, 43, 54, 129 to 30, 133, 189, 196, 335. Fear. 111, 124, 126, 157 to 58, 213, 255, 299. Hypotaxis. 94, 124 to 25. Mumbling. 263 to 64, 362, note 35. Ontology. 59 to 60, 127, 129, 132, 226, 231, 239 to 40, 305. Opera. 117, 139, 144, 248, 286, 355 to 56, 360, 363, 367 to 69. Ordinary. 11, 79, 184 to 88, 209. Parataxis. 83, 94, 124 to 25, 190, 329, 348. Pathos. 33, 192, 233, 273 to 5, 296, 301, 319, 361, 371, 377, 396. Patterning. 14, 23 to 24, 68, 94, 106, 111, 144, 167 to 68, 190, 203, 208, 264 to 65, 351, 357 to 58, 361 to 62, 370. Race. 14, 35 to 36, 105, 135, 253, 263, 297. See also ethnicity, whiteness. Sadness. 192, 216, 302, 376. Sarcasm. 103, 233, 309, 311, 337. Satire. 33, 76, 128, 130, note 18, 133, 179, 224, 315, 371. Stutter. 25, 224, 228, 393.
Forward from Paul Auster. 25 sentences containing the words Charles Bernstein. Charles Bernstein is a poet. Charles Bernstein is a critic. Charles Bernstein is a man who talks. And whether he is writing or talking, Charles Bernstein is a troublemaker. Being fond of troublemakers myself, I am particularly fond of the troublemaker designated by the words Charles Bernstein. Charles Bernstein has reintroduced a spirit of polemic into the world of American poetry. In the exhausted atmosphere in which so much of our writing takes place, Charles Bernstein has battled long and hard to make both writers and readers aware of the implications embedded in each and every language act we partake of as citizens of this vast, troubled country. Whether or not you agree with what Charles Bernstein has to say is less important than the fact that it has become more and more important to listen to what he is saying. At times, Charles Bernstein reminds me of a Talmudic rabbi. At times, Charles Bernstein reminds me of a stand-up comic performing for the late-night crowd at a Borscht Belt hotel, booked in for a 2-week run and never using the same material twice. At times, Charles Bernstein reminds me of the city slicker who walks into a Wild West saloon and orders a glass of milk, and then proceeds to outpunch, outshoot, and outwit all the roughnecks who laugh at him. What I mean to say is that Charles Bernstein is unpredictable. Charles Bernstein is everywhere. Charles Bernstein is relentless and wholly committed to speaking and writing the truth as he sees it and hears it and lives it. Now that we have settled into our seats and are ready to begin, I will repeat the words Charles Bernstein, only once more. But this last time is the best time of all, for it allows me to experience the pleasure of saying, "Here is Charles Bernstein."
Leap for Lee Jimin. Poetry is more than meets the eye. It's more than meets the ear, too. It's a total mind expansion through verbal, vocal, and visual extravagances. Poetry is not just an expansion of the mind, but of perception and heart. But it can't be understood by trying to figure it out. You need to take a leap of faith into the poem. Just jump into it as if you were jumping into a hole in a frozen lake, fearing perhaps you will drown or freeze. But once in the water, it's as warm as a hot spring. And even if you can't swim, all of a sudden you'll be floating on the poem's surface, then plunging deep. It just takes a leap of poetic faith.
Poetry Month will be a little late this year. Poetry's freedom, which is to say, poetry's essential contribution to American culture, is grounded in its aversion of conformity and its resistance to the restrictions of market-driven popularity. Indeed, contemporary American poetry thrives through its small scale and radical differences of form. There is no one sort of American poetry, and certainly no right sort. This is what makes aesthetic invention so necessary.
Free verse is not a type of non-metrical poetry, but an imperative to liberate verse from the constraints of obligatory convention and regulation. In that sense, free verse is an aspiration, and its stuttering breathlessness is a mark of its impossibility, or, in other terms, free verse is sexually verse, or versatile, meaning making multiple turns, as verse means turn taking as top, bottom, side, invert, pervert, univert, subvert, nonvert, unvert.
The goal is to find the wilderness in bewilderment, or is that the process? The more realistic a poet is, the more distant from reality. Suscavir. I cannot make it decohere. I want not just a politics of identity, but an aesthetics of identity.
The world doesn't make sense. We do. Sense is of the word and in the world. The non-human is also beyond the human. Assisted living? As opposed to what? Poetry is reacquired taste, after David Bergman. Nearly touching are the ethical realm of our obligation to others and the aesthetic world of our freedom from such obligations, for Rachel Levitsky. Stanley Cavell. The loss of a public is in fact the artist's withdrawal from his public as a consequence of his faithfulness to his art. The public is lost to art because they are readying themselves for war, for life by the gun. They are also lost because of art, because art maintains itself against their assaults, and because almost against its will, it unsettles the illusions by means of which civilized people conduct themselves.
Those ardent in their beliefs and certain of God's will are the faithless ones. The thing is, life is a one-way street. Gods need us more than we need them, because without us, they would not exist. But without them, we do. I am for a single prayer initiative. God loves those who think for themselves. Physical distance / social intimacy, a kind of poetry. How the music learned to write. The poem that is true for all people and all times is true for no one and no time.
I've never met a person who cried fire when confronted by a snowball. But there are many today who cry freedom when confronted with tyranny. My aggrievement may be absolute to me, but that does not make it greater than yours. My freedom is only that to the extent it guarantees yours. Anything different, to the extent of the difference, is not liberty. It is oppression. Like a memorial, except we're all alive. Or we imagine we're alive, even though we died weeks ago. The fight for truthfulness is a fight against the claim of a single truth. At best, science and poetry both move toward truth through an insistence on truthfulness. Religion and politics sometimes. Demagoguery never. The temporary loss of our physical commons is devastating, but the commons needed now is imaginary, not territorial. Those who know God's truth won't say. Those who say don't know. After Abraham Sutzkever. Injury to the imaginary is trauma. The imaginary commons is art.
Offbeat. If you say I'm offbeat, my dear, you know it hurts me, ain't that clear? Only the privileged have ears like yours. All I got's what's given by my dear Lord. If you insist my behavior is unsuitable, classifying my compositions unmusical, my argument may be untenable, is that it's bossa nova that is the most natural. What you don't know, what you refuse to sense, is my offbeats come straight from the heart. I photographed you with my Rolleiflex. What I see is what you don't love, my art. Don't talk about my love. It's far more than you are capable of. You and your music forget the key. The sounds inside me beat off key. Deep and quietly inside of me. The beats off key to hit the heart, but you don't see. After Desafinado, 1958, by Newton Mendoza and Antonio Carlos Jobim.
The untimely. If a poem fails in a forest because no one hears it, is it still a poem? If a poem denies time, is it any less timely? Might we speak of a timely poem, but also an untimely one? The more a poem is in time, the more it becomes part of the folds and veils of deep time. In other words, a poem is always in now time, with one foot in before, one foot in after, and another in neither. Time is a daydream to which we escape. Meaning meanders in the meantime, meaning by means of means at hand. If most people have no time for art, I want a poetry that inhabits that no time. Most days I am happy if a poem can make it through the night.
Why say something in prose when you can say it as easily in poetry, in poetics?
On the equal signs. Once we decided to use the name language, we came up against the fact that this was the title of the Journal of the Linguistic Society of America, as made famous for us all by Jack Spicer's Language. So we faced the practical problem of differentiating. The idea was to find a graphical difference, and Bruce and I decided on the equal signs, though I can't say why. It looked good. We asked Susan B. to make a logo. The actual logo that appears atop the first issue was made by Susan in conjunction with her father, Sigmund Lofer, who was a graphic designer and also had the CompuGraphic machine to generate the type. But he had to physically paste the letters and equal signs in because the machine couldn't get them close enough together.
No hiding place.
I thought language poetry was a place to escape from my pain. A place I could make my pain plain. A place I could make my pain plain and gain.
I thought language poetry was against emotion in the name of sensation.
I thought language poetry was against theory in favor of praxis.
I thought language poetry was lots of words making the most of meaning.
I thought language poetry was the die-hard foe of the massed mediocrity.
I thought language poetry was a big tent without a roof or a floor.
I thought language poetry was sympathy without tea.
I thought language poetry was ambient sound in serial locomotion.
I thought language poetry has branches in Paris, New York, Toronto, and Palm Springs.
I thought language poetry was Marxist.
I thought language poetry was anarchist.
I thought language poetry was the Antichrist.
I thought language poetry was bourgeois aestheticism.
I thought language poetry hated the voice.
I thought language poetry was all voicing and never content.
I thought language poetry was against realism.
I thought language poetry was a new form of realism.
I thought language poetry was against dogma.
I thought language poetry refused its commissars.
I thought language poetry was against closed groups.
I thought language poetry was all thought in pursuit of potential action.
I thought language poetry was Gertrude Stein all over again.
I thought language poetry was trying to make the reader feel smart.
I thought language poetry was wary of proclamations of sincere expression.
I thought language poetry was a lot of nonsense, packaged to look important.
I thought language poetry was the possibility for freedom.
I thought language poetry was the major precursor to word salad email spam.
I thought language poetry was short for L equals A equals N equals G equals U equals A equals G equals E poetry.
I thought language poetry favored style over manner.
I thought language poetry was too intellectual.
I thought language poetry was too difficult to ignore.
I thought language poetry was the cat's scratch.
I thought language poetry was neither a school nor a movement, but a transient moment.
I thought language poetry was a chimerical constellation.
I thought language poetry was tendencies and investments, not rules or orders.
I thought language poetry was minor literature with a vengeance.
I thought language poetry was a collective figment of a collective imagination.
I thought language poetry was an illusion.
I thought language poetry was over.
I thought language poetry resists the authority of language poetry.
Here's my takeaway. Only anti-elitist poetry should win elite prizes.
Let me make this plain. The hatred of avant-garde poetry is a prerequisite for entry into any official verse culture worth its smelling salts. The avant-garde is a good target because it is indeed populated by fascists, miscreants, and malcontents, along with communists and saints, hopeless romantics, and middle-class idlers. But how much more exhilarating and what an effective distraction to attack the avant-garde for sins found equally in the mainstream. And how convenient to redeem non-white poets from such censure, albeit with a wink, those often overlooked poets who blazed a path for radical aesthetics and miscegenated free thinking in American poetry, without whom avant-garde American poetry, whatever that could possibly be, could not exist.
We are all sinners in the clutches of a dyspeptic God. But there is a blessed election that allows for redemption of some poets and artists, irrespective of the conduct or misconduct of their works, just as, ever again, some are excommunicated regardless of their good works. While election ensures redemption, fear wrath still. Such exemption does not license free thinking or free feeling in the poem. To be saved, even an elect's poem needs a biographicalist hook or some other value that lies outside of it, a value that can be extracted, such as the poet's suffering, identification with suffering, or, if nothing else, moral sentiment. Poetry, like pornography, requires redeeming social value.
There is no perfect in poetry, but there can be more perfection. Every success has a countermeasure of failure. The better you do one thing, the more you fail to do something else. That is why monotheism in poetry is a crime against aesthetics, which does not mean anything goes. Anything is possible, but only a very few things get through that eye of a needle that separates charm from harm. And often what appears as harm has got the charm.
Harder for a rich man to write a good poem than to buy a good painting. The hardest part, why bother?
My soul believes only its own ears, even Ezra. I can't be wrong about that. If I love a poem, can I love it tastelessly? Or is it that I love its tastelessness? Reb Bint Eliza would say that the discussion of taste is more important than the preference for one taste over another. I don't want to know what you prefer, but rather, what's your criteria? The Rebbe would always say.
Once two poets came to King Solomon, each insisting that the poet they most revered was the greater poet. Solomon said that each of them should burn the books of the poets and read only the Torah. What a jerk. Don't confuse the author of the Song of Songs with the earlier king. King S would surely resent that he is best known for poetry he couldn't and wouldn't have written.
Even so, maybe King Solomon would have echoed his poet avatar and said that it is not the poem, but its kiss that matters. Let the poem kiss you with the kisses of its mouth, for love is better than wine. There are many poets who say the kiss of a lover is far greater than any poem. But kisses grow cold and hard, while a poem will never betray you.
Am I hearing correctly that you are arguing that the Bible says that sex is better than art? I mean that art is better than the real thing? I mean that the real thing is better than sex? I mean that sex kills the real thing and pornography veils it?
No. The kiss in the Song of Songs symbolizes aesthetic experience, which is akin to Shekinah, the presence of God. And while each of us might say our lover is the best of all lovers, we accept the plurality of loves, as it would be monstrous to think there are only a few great loves and the rest are minor. Love is plentiful and always next to us. The difficulty is in acknowledging its presence rather than shunning it.
I used to be a philosopher, but now I am philosophized.
Used to be a poet, but now am the words.
Used to be critical, but now take the local.
I used to be emotional, but now I've got affect.
I used to be empirical, but now I am in the dark.
Used to believe in process, but now can't get it to stop.
I used to be cosmological, but now I am pataposterous.
I used to make arguments, but now am argumentative.
Used to be historical, but now can't work up the energy even for that.
Used to dream of answers, but no longer remember the questions.
I used to love knowledge, but now know language.
Used to go to school, but now vagabond.
Used to be, but now am.
Poets like to quote philosophers because they got a theory that explains or a morality that proclaims. And so says, every time you hit a brick wall, it's because some bugger put it there to keep you in your place. But it's not really a brick wall, it's a glass ceiling. And even glass ceilings have legs. Then again, philosophers like to quote poetry because it adds a superficial layer of depth to the proceedings, which generally end in poetry being found guilty of a crime it only wishes it could commit.
People say Cavell is too literary for a philosopher. I aspire to be too philosophical for a poet.
I am the shell of the person I once was, the shell of the shell of the shell's shell, but then the person I once was is a shell of the person I now am. The problem of reference is like finding the pea under the shell, under the husk in a street corner scam. The pea is there, but only insofar as it is structured by the sham hands of the street corner apparatus.
There's a pea, all right, but it's the system, baby. Always the system.
It's a mug's game.
I'm not interested in emotion tranquilized into legible form. My register goes from rapture to rupture, often in the same breath, from despair to hysteria to preternatural calm, from anxiety to disassociation, from agitation to evanescence. In my book, dyslexia is emotional and fragmentation, a kind of aesthetic melodrama approaching tragedy. Interruption and inscrutability enthrall me. I desire impersonality, but every time I get close, it shakes me off.
Being human is a condition, an animality, not a positive value. Being human is not something poems I like or don't like are more or less interested in, though being insufficiently human sounds like a good direction for poetry, an inhumanimality.
When the child dies, the father dies. It's a mortal wound. What disappears in death grows wild in imagination. Wanderer's Knockfield by Goethe, in memoriam Marjorie Perloff. In her most recent book, In for Thin, Perloff talks about the famous 24-word Goethe poem, Wanderer's Knockfield, and insists that the rest in the poem, as in over all crests is rest, refers to just a passing rest, just rest, rather than, as some critics think, death. She's very insistent on putting off this reading of death rather than even thinking of the toggling between death and rest, which is, of course, infra-thin. The same word, ruest or ru, could mean resting or death. Here's Marjorie talking about it.
Just about, I would say, a perfect poem, and yet the subject seems, in certain ways, slight. I'll read it first for you in German, then in English. Über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhm. In allen Wipfeln spürest du kaum einen Hauch. Die Vögelein schweigen im Walde. Warte nur, balde ruhest du auch. There has been much discussion about the meaning, and ironically, Jonathan Culler talks about this poem and says it's about death. Many people have said that because wanderers. I don't think so at all. I think I just take it quite literally, maybe because I know, what Goethe was doing at the time and that he wanted rest, but he certainly wasn't looking forward to death. He never did. Was somebody, the most life-loving person I can think of, and not in that kind of mood at all, that rest must mean death. I think it's just quite literal that it's been a hard day in a way. And now everything is quieting down. And now you'll be able, and this is what rest is like. But just wait soon. You will rest too. But there are other people who have related it to some kind of cry for death, because the idea of a wanderer's night song.
So that was Marjorie talking with me about a year before she died. And here's my translation for her, same 24 words as in the Goethe poem. And I think now Marjorie is right. It's just a rest. Over all crests is rest. On high you hear, hardly a breath, the hummingbirds silent in nests. Just wait until you too will rest.
Pierre Joris's cantos diurno are never solemn, but they acknowledge the darkness that surrounds, as Robert Creeley once put it, that we are always behind our ideals, hopes, aspirations, premonitions, regrets, fears. Behind, both in the sense of supporting and after, trying to catch up, desperately for the most part. But in these poems, not desperate, but fortunate, in good humors and with humor.
American poetry is born in second languages. It is our bounty and the secret of our success, if we have any, as much as Samson's long hair, once upon a time, was the source of his strength. That's why any attempt to homogenize and assimilate undermines the foundations of our poetics.
Pierre's work is marked by a rare virtue for an American poet, coraggio. Everybody is always talking about affect, but nobody ever does anything about it. We used to say, lifts your spirit, but that applies more to Thanksgiving balloons than to challenging verse. I want poetry like this that changes my mind, puts me in the sway of currents of resistance and change, where the courage is not just what is said, but what is refused, the sanctity of the fixed place, nation or ideal, banner or standard. It's not just the tyranny of monolingualism that Pierre's verse contests. It's the tyranny of all forms of monomania, single-mindedness in perspective, style, politics, form, language, identity, desire. Quote, I speak in voices, always, always, other people's voices, 1,000 mouths, unquote. We all turned away from virtues when that meant some uppity guy telling us the way we led our lives is base? What happens if the bass speaks in basso profundo, as in being pro-fun, with doing more than the done?
Now is a little on the early side, don't you think? We never arrive there. Then again, we're never anywhere else. I like to think of history as a set of frames that lets us see one part of what's before our eyes at the cost of framing out something else. That's why seeing is always temporal, always mediated by words.
We see not just through words, but with words. There's no way around it. Yet the idea is precarious. Put it this way, abstraction is never more than an extension of figuration, just as figuration is never more than an extension of abstraction.
For the last 2 decades, Tracie Morris has been transfiguring the relation of text to performance and word to sound. Such signature Morris works as Slave Show to Video, aka Black But Beautiful, and Chain Gang are scoreless sound poems originating in an improvised live performance. At the same time, Morris has published text-based works in Intermission and Rhyme Scheme and other more recent works. Handholding is the first collection of Morris's work to present a full spectrum of her approaches to poetry. This is not so much a collection of poems as conventionally understood as a display of the possibilities for poetry. Each work here is not just a different style or form, but rather explores different aspects of poetry as a medium, resounding, revising, resonating, recalling, reperforming, reimaginings. In handholding, the medium is massaged so that troglodyte binaries like politics and aesthetics, original and translation, oral and written, go the way of Plato's cave by way of Niagara Falls. In her first recordings, Morris was already crossing the Rubicon between spoken word and sound poetry, showing the river was only skin deep. In one of the 2 revisionist versions of a major modernist poem in this collection, Morris returns to the magnum opus of modernist sound poetry, Kurt Schwitter's Sonata, 1922 to 1932. For Resonata, or Resonate, Morris does not perform Schwitter's score. Rather, she collaborates with the signal recording of the work by Schwitter's son, Ernst. We don't hear Ernst's recording in Morris's work, but she is taking her cue from this performance. Because Morris has dispersed with the written alphabetic score, she's able to improvise, loop, extend, and re-perform Sonata in a way that sets her performance apart. Her tempo is at least half the pace of Christian Book's magnificent athletic version, which has become a classic of the sound poetry repertoire. Resonata spatializes the pitch of Sonata as she reforms its rhythms, creating a meditative interior space that makes a resonant contrast to Book. Indeed, to fully understand the achievements of Morris and Book, you need to listen to both. While Book's performance creates an outer-directed, propulsive acoustic sound, Morris creates an inner-directed, intimate one. This becomes especially poignant midway in the performance, when rather than create a percussive rhythm with the phonemes popping against one another, Morris practically lapses into speech, into talking, into direct address. Resonate is a brilliant charm, deepening and extending the modernist classic in a way comparable to Glenn Gould's revisionist Bach.
Susan B. and I first met Joanna Drucker in 1977 in a large tent in Bryant Park on the grounds of the New York Public Library during a small press book fair. Drucker was exhibiting her first few letterpress books, which immediately caught my attention as just the kind of work that I wanted to focus on in a new journal Bruce Andrews and I were just starting. L equals A equals N equals G equals U equals A equals G equals E. Indeed, I reviewed Drucker's From A to Z in the first issue of L equals A equals N equals G equals U equals A equals G equals E, commenting on its uncanny fusing of constructivist constraints. She had set every piece of type from a set of 45 type drawers she had acquired. Sumptuous physical detail, a vision of textual excess and density, and wry meta-narrative commentary. Drucker's works, including her unlikely and necessary creation of a supernal body of scholarship exploring the history of alphabets and the theory of the visual representation of language, have remained central to my own sense of writing in the years since. In a wider context, her work has become ever more relevant with the introduction of new writing reproduction and distribution technologies.
Tan Lynn's poetry is just way too cool. Lynn's poems are as chic as they are sharp and ingenious. They slap you in the face like a blue cheese in a sheep market. Lynn returns us to the most traditional ideals for reading. Words, so transitory today, are fundamental elements that constitute Orphic engagements, singular among the many technologies that make up the shape of our rich semiotic landscape. You get the sense that Lynn's words are meant to last forever, and they leave you feeling fresh and ready for a new day. By setting up a textual ecology, archiving and rejuvenating language, Lynn makes us aware of something that is beyond both the material and ephemeral nature of words. Language is solid and palpable. Plunge the depths, close read, dwell, savor, project. Today, these figments of eternity have come together between the covers of this book. Tomorrow, they'll be canonized. Also available in a wide selection of designer colors. This new book is a dazzling display of aesthetic elan and as charming as Magritte's pipe or Velázquez's Pope. In 33 uncontrolled vocabularies in a historical vacuum adores a poem, Lynn makes language pop, sizzle, melt, careen, dodge, sparkle, and reform you late. Lynn's work sparkles with unoriginality and falsification. He wants to make good on his sense of language as temporal and changing, subject to cancellation and decay, of language's borrowing, or is it hallowing? Failure to specify anything in the here and now, as he puts it. Lynn's poems are temporal processes cast into words, permeable, open, meandering. Yes, I am lying to you, he says. No, he is not lying to you. Breathe as you read.
From an interview with Feng Yi on Chinese-American intersections. I told a friend of mine who has achieved great success in American poetry, you really stand for something. Me, I stand for nothing, and not even that. But I'll sit for a good cup of wonton soup and an egg roll.
I have nothing to say about this. Nothing in the sense of a lot. Nothing in the sense of no thing. How can you convey that quality of the English word in Chinese? In the sense of not one thing. I've often used this word along with blank, blankness, emptiness, empty, in a generative sense. but it does not grate against the Judeo-Christian tradition, where nothing is no good, suggesting the absence of God and morality. You can see this echoed in T.S. Eliot's iconic title, The Wasteland, a world without meaning or purpose, filled with unbelievers. Genesis begins with a void, or perhaps an emptiness, from which the light of divine creation comes. Is that void like a black hole, or again, an English homonym, black hole? The Hebrew is ohu va vohu, unformed or without form and empty. But this could also be potentiality, openness.
Another book I carried around in high school, though it was far too big to fit in my pocket, was The Bible of Existentialism, Sartre's Being and Nothingness. The tagline has become a cliche. Existence precedes essence. Essence in the sense of meaning and values, existence in the sense of raw and finite being towards death. For Sartre, humans create and dismantle value through projections cast onto a finite void, conjuring a flickering veil of infinite illusions. These values, produced through a negation of the given order, are illusory, but not necessary, are illutio necessaria.
And all the while, we were listening to the great leftist folk singer Woody Guthrie in This Land Is Your Land, which is for many of us the real American national anthem. He points to a sign that says private property. On the other side, Guthrie sings, it doesn't say nothing. This land is made for you and me.
I often say disagreements in poetry are theological, though those who would condemn poetry like mine as meaningless don't see the view as theological as much as just common sense or upright and socially responsible. The French poet Edmond Jabez says that meaning occurs not in the form, letters, or words, but in the blank space between them, in the potential for infinite combination that is the space of openness as blank. This is the basis of echo poetics, E-C-H-O, echo poetics. Meaning is not in any one letter or word, but in the resonance among them and the possibilities for infinite recombination, in what Blake calls the echoing green. This is the space of no thing, or the infinite possibility of things, newly forming at each moment. You could say this is a poetics of transvaluation, turning what may at first appear as a deficit into its opposite, but also seeing the catastrophic problems with fixed, ahistorical, invariant ideas of morality and meaning.
A disciple once asked, "Master, what is Tao?" The master said, 3 gin of flax."
I love Zen koans with their apparent non sequiturs. Micropoems, don't you think? My work is filled with fractured, twistering aphorisms. The comic and enigmatic undercuts the high seriousness and prescriptive quality of much religious teaching. And there is also a misrajic aspect, rabbis arguing over contradictory interpretations of the text at hand. We could call those Zen Kohens, if you can bear the terrible pun on the common Jewish name, which is the name associated with an ancient caste of Jewish priests.
What is the sound of one hand clapping? The poem for a reader. What is poetry? 3 flasks of gin with a flax chaser, a Zen scone.
Verbal language has a juridical and informational function that makes it seem different from the language of music and visual art, though iconicity is inevitable in all human art forms. As much as I appreciate listening to poetry as if it were music or art, I'm also interested in reading visual art and textualizing music. One result might be recognizing that the difference between figurative and abstract is a matter of interpretation. No visual mark is free of iconicity. This is what is so significant for me about the Chinese calligraphy as a means of performing poems. The Metropolitan Museum of Art generally does not translate the poems in its sublime Chinese calligraphy collection, which may encourage looking at these works as if they were abstract visual art. In fact, they do look a bit like the work of Franz Klein and other abstract expressionists. Do the different versions of a poem change the meaning of a poem? Does seeing the calligraphy performed live, as if it were a dance, change the meaning?
What is meaning?
Meaning is bricks.
I want to read a poem as if it were a poem. One of my aesthetic precepts is indeed the most unruly is the most perfect. It's similar to the aesthetic preference for torn edge versus straight cut, unbalanced over symmetrical, bumpy or clumpsy over smooth, inconsistency over constancy, upside down more than right side up. These preferences become formulas, but in my case, they are also lived, felt perceptions and connect to cognitive deficits transformed by poetic justice, deficit gain. Pound called his translation of Confucius the unwobbling pivot. What I'm after, or in the thrall of, or maybe just trying to get out from under, is the swerving spigot.
The hobbling rivet.
Not unbalanced, balanced differently, balanced by other means.
I swerve for poetry.
Language's acknowledgement.
The land that never has been yet. Langston Hughes.
I live in Brooklyn, New York, also called Kings County, though we have no kings of Brooklyn and go out of our way not to speak the king's English. 500 years ago, these lands were inhabited by people whose ancestors spoke Lenape, Munsee, among many other languages in the region. Most of those languages are now endangered or lost because of the genocide by mostly English and Dutch-speaking Christian immigrants who are unable to share this place with those who did not worship their God. I am a sojourner in this borough with people whose ancestors were abducted in Africa, brought here with catastrophic cruelty and enslaved. Their ancestors spoke Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, and Bantu languages, among others. Many of my neighbors came here, or their parents or their grandparents came here from every part of the globe to find sanctuary from economic, ethnic, racial, and religious persecution, from famine, death, genocide, and dispossession. Some came simply to seek a better life. Their ancestors spoke hundreds of different languages, from Chinese to Celtic, Italian to Bengali, Yiddish and Polish, Russian to Spanish, Vietnamese, Arabic, Armenian, Creole, Portuguese, and Tagalog, to name only a small fraction. Some of these languages percolate through the many accents you hear on the streets of Brooklyn, but others are almost stilled. Still, when you closely listen, you can hear them too, in the burning spaces between the words and in the spaces between the spaces. Those spaces are our native tongue. English is second language, even for those for whom it is the only language. I is they is us.
Here we were in medias res, thar she blew, and all the time I thought it was my heart propounding. Sometimes I think I talk in riddles, think in riddles, or the riddle talks me, but mine are riddles without answers, rattles. I am riddled with echoes. It's not that there is nothing but frames any more than then there is nothing but eyes or ears or minds. Our perception is informed and informing. Frames frame us, so naturally we want to beat the rap or at least protest the injustice. Problem is, we are guilty as charged. Beating the rap is the foundation of rhythm in my prosody. And isn't a rap a kind of husk? Imagine that the reel is blank and that we come to terms with it by our midrashic overlays. What's blank is not meaningless or void, it is a site of possibility. Paved roads with direction signs are fine, but one thing a poem can do is show the road. So, husk is to frame as bewilderment is to grappling.
Alter cockers, cranky poems for aging with anger, resentment, intemperance, and regret. Poems to help you age without losing your negative capabilities. This anthology collects centuries of poems of bad advice and denial, guaranteed to pour salt on wounds large and small, from poets who developed exquisite expertise in nursing old wounds in old age and exacerbating infirmities, real and imagined. Sections include, I don't want a revolution if I have to dance. Despair springs eternal. I did it before you were born. And incontinent songs. Name withheld, the rest of the family says, a comfortless collection bound to agitate and annoy while discouraging the elderly from aging gracefully. Coming soon from You Bet Your Life Press's Dorothy Parker collection.
Woodstock, Peace and Mud. All through my first year at college, I listened to the LPs of the musicians who assembled at Woodstock the following summer, having bought most of the albums one by one on my frequent visits to Sam Goody's Rockefeller Center store. I recently gave the remainder of my LP collection, several overstuffed boxes, to Lawrence Kumpf of Blank Forms, though only after Jay Saunders and Bruce Pearson had skimmed the cream.
Though I never had a cream record. I knew many of the songs of the Woodstock bands by heart, and they were the soundtrack for the anti-war, anti-racist demonstrations that led to my arrest in college just months before the music festival.
Susan and I bought advance tickets for Woodstock in 1969, a big expense for us at the time. We drove out to Bethel from New York, getting snarled up in a day-long, not day-glow traffic jam. We ended up parking in deep mud in a field, perhaps a mile from the festival. I had no idea how we would be able to get out of this space. Such were the bourgeois concerns that overwhelmed me at the time. The area in front of the music stage was packed with people. From where we stood, sitting in the mud was no more appealing to me than it would be then. It was impossible to see the faces of the musicians. The sound was considerably worse than from my 1957 AM portable radio. There were long lines for the uninviting portable toilets, and no apparent way to get water or food. I was verklempt.
It was raining, and we had come totally unprepared. City kids, we had never gone camping. Large crowds of intoxicated people jammed into a small space has never been my idea of fun. I was never a hippie, as I have to tell my children repeatedly, even if I sometimes looked and seemed to act like one. Susan and I agreed, let's go home. We were able to find the car, no mean feat, and with some trouble got it out of the mud and on the road. This time, no traffic jam, returning to the apartment of a high school friend near 79th and Riverside Drive, where we were staying in the summer of 1969. I should have kept my Woodstock tickets. They are worth more than the refund I got from the promoters. Yes, I did apply for and receive a refund. Back in the Upper West Side, you don't know how lucky you are, boys. I sat on the couch and listened for the nth time to Country Joe and the Fish. I feel like I'm fixing to die rag in wraparound stereo sound. They never sounded so good.
The Taint of the Human. In an effort to make humanities classes more accessible to a wide range of students and boost enrollment, Hodgepodge University has eliminated the requirement for reading poems in all classes. Instructors will be required to offer prose summaries as the primary text for examination. Original poems will be provided, if at all, as optional reading. Because of the taint of the human and the human participation in environmental destruction, tyranny, and violence, Hodgepodge University has decided to eliminate the study of human-produced documents, instead focusing on the non-human world. Because of the morally repugnant nature of much animal behavior, Hodgepodge University has decided to remove biology from the curriculum. We will continue to focus on the non-human sciences. Because the non-human sciences lack the critical thinking previously offered by the humanities, Hodgepodge University has decided to cease all instruction in these fields. Classes will meet in silence.
Memorial after Heinrich Heine. No mass will anyone sing, no Kaddish will anyone say, neither said nor sung by none when I'm done. But maybe one day, when the weather's bright and gay, out for a stroll in Montmartre, my Paulina alongside Madame Christina, with garlands of evergreen comes she to adorn my grave and sigh, oh, my poor guy, wet melancholy in her eye. Alas, dwell I way too high, that even for my sweet a stool I can't supply. Geez, her weary wobbling feet, sweetie, fatty, don't go back to your house by foot at the curb. Grab a cab or a duck or a purse.
Why a duck? Because someone may be throwing a punch.
Quote, certainly there be that delight in giddiness, and count it a bondage to fix a belief, affecting free will in thinking, as well as in acting, unquote. Francis Bacon writes of In Truth. I don't want to run from this warning so much as up the ante. I use something else Bacon writes as an epigraph to professing poetics in Attack of the Difficult Poems. But it is not the lie that passeth through the mind, but the lie that sinketh in and settleth in it, that doth the hurt, such as we spake of before, unquote. That's perjurocracy. My neologism, for rule by those who violate the public trust, which echoes Pound's neologism, perjurocracy, rule by the worst.
The illicitness of the comic, like the radical impersonality of the scientific method, has the potential of unsettling truth, of setting it free.
Where freedom is not an end, but precariously transitory.
The comic, as a method of aesthetic intensification, is best when its giddiness is measured by its ability to resist redemption.
A nightmare is haunting America and Europe. Its slogan could be, I am aggrieved by your aggrievement. The danger is depoliticization in reversion to instinctual loyalty. Aggrievement is not an end of politics, but its beginning. And yet, it's true that freedom of speech, including tolerating pernicious ideas, though hopefully not with silence but with vocal dissent, benefits those with power more than those without it, which is given in a pejorocracy.
Some of the most liberating thinking about poetry is, at the same time, a poison. The cure that is a curse, which means it is possible to mistake one for the other.
Curing might be good for meat, but perhaps not thought. Lest salami turn to bologna.
I want a poetics that gets by without cures, and where the curses curtsy in time to unheard maladies. My homeland is diasporic. When the Bollingen was announced, I got flooded with letters of congratulation. I'm grateful for each one. You deserve it, many wrote. I was heartened, but I know you deserve it is also what one says to someone who is made to walk the plank. The jury is always out on poetry. Each reader delivers the verdict for a poem every time they read it. And in that lies poetry's freedom. Maybe I have lived a happy life as best I could, which means with my share of unhappiness, real and imagined. Do I seem grumpy? Is being a curmudgeon the essence of poetry?
Why not just get along?
I prefer not to, because I can. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Felix, Ton, Christian, Tracie.